I thought perhaps I should talk about the process a little bit of what it was like to create these pieces of art over a period of about 2 months. So in that time period, the months leading up to the actual work, I had it in the back of my mind, and I was coming up with little phrases or ideas of what parts of desire I wanted to speak to, what I wanted to address. And I think for me, it was the sense of longing. This is number 7. A body submits its pressure. Hold tight yours against all measures and others. When is lust ever sensible? Keep this heat and the longed for. What it does to a body is make it live. What I wanted to explore was the idea of living with the body's desires, moment by moment. I think there's the initial rush of a longing, that small thing that suddenly awakens and explodes. And while it is true there are some people in this world who are more sensitive than others, I think that we all have the possibility, we all have the potential of awakening our sensitivities. These bodies we have been given, these biological containers for our minds, are our greatest tool to tune in to another person, to touch them in some small way. It is such a gift. Number 4. Atop rifts in windy peaks the falcon makes a selection of breaths beyond her wings' rapid beats, soon pulled taut as she dives and then exposes her beak and breast to maw and thrust of another's appetite. She dies, you see. The giving over soon begets, as surely as you, walking swiftly here towards me. And so, these 13 poems are a journey, in a way. They're quite short for what I'm used to writing. I tend to pack my poetry with a lot of imagery, a lot of lyricism, a good deal of narrative story that happens. And so, because of the amount of time it takes to actually hammer a line of poetry or even a word into steel, I tried to be brief. I tried to pull a single idea into each small poem. The watercolors are an homage to the body, to the sensuality of the feminine form, mostly, simply because it's what I'm closest to. And I think the feminine form is historically one of the most beautiful things on this planet. And so these little glimpses of the sensuous life of the female form are a way of touching upon the timelessness of the human body, the timelessness of the sensuous nature of the female form and how it can draw one in, figuratively and literally. And so this is number 6. Where the elbow bends, there are 3 words for the taking. 1 of pressure and of pause before the breaking. Another of backwards glances as the body continues forwards. The third has something to do with crashing or exploding, or the wettish lusts of hungry creatures. When painting in watercolor, one has to be very patient with one's own expectations. To have an image of a form in mind and then to put the brush to paper. To watch the paint move in the water and change form is quite astonishing. And so you must be quick and keep up with the water before it begins to evaporate. The boxes finally were a long process as well. I had been asking around amongst my friends for several months to find a woodworker, someone who was interested in crafting some beautiful wooden boxes for me to place the watercolors into. And then the task would have been to hammer the poetry into the wood doors of these small boxes, these little cabinets. And of course, I think hammering into wood would have been a little bit more forgiving and easier on the wrist. However, I kept coming up empty. I met a few woodworkers and talked about the project a little bit, and there wasn't any one person who got excited about the idea as much as I was. And so that's how collaboration goes sometimes. And then so I ended up dropping in on a good friend of mine who happens to be a welder. He was telling me something about various projects he'd been working on, and it suddenly occurred to me. I proposed the idea right away. I said, I'm wanting to create these beautiful boxes for my watercolors and for poetry. And of course they can be metal. They can be a really strong metal. They can be steel. And would you be interested in helping me with this? And he said yes immediately. Number 1, a night not yours, not any given degree of conformity, but a tender respite, a sanctuary for damp and heat and need. You will be given what you need. And so that began my love affair with steel and hammering into steel. The force which is required is very hard on the body, the arm, the wrist, the reverberations of hitting, using a steel hammer against a steel peg which has a letter at the end of it into a steel plate upon a steel table upon a concrete floor. It makes the whole body kind of reverberate with each hammering. But every time I did it, it got easier and I got faster at it, and it was so much fun that I was very sad when I finished the final poem. And so the craft of hammering the poems into the steel happened over about a month's time, when I had a free hour or so to get in and hammer. But in between that, I hadn't written the poems yet, so they were They were being written in between each of my hammering sessions, and so the words as I was hammering and reading and rereading them, the story unfolded all by itself. I had to simply open to it. And I find that that's how most of my poetry is written, reading a lot of other poetry. I read specifically a good deal of Emily Dickinson's words during this time, and so that helps me in so many ways, simply because she's extremely precise. Number 5. You have held up your hands against need until your edges strayed, and in the losing, your bordered being is soon seized by its unraveling. The house where I grew up, the kitchen sink was in the corner of the kitchen where there was no window, and so my mother had hung on the wall behind the sink these various plaques and cloth-like scrolls which had quotes from famous poets written on them. And so I washed dishes there all the time, reading these famous lines of poetry over and over and over and over again. That was a consideration. It came back to me when I started creating these boxes. The lines that capture me are the lines that captured them. And so then I eliminated the idea of thinking of an audience and tried to write very specifically. Some rhymed, some refused to rhyme, and then when I began hammering those lines into the metal, some of those lines wanted more space. Some of those words wanted to be centered, line by line, and so I was very much opening myself to the process all along the way, to however it wanted to manifest. And so having poetry of desire hammered into a durable metal has such an interesting effect on my sensibilities. The symbolism behind that is extraordinary to me, and how ironic and beautiful is that. This is the final poem in the series of Poetic Boxes. Number 13. Once you return from ecstasies, time refashions sweet your little sufferings. You'll walk through this world as a drowned thing dripping twigs and leaves, breathing blameless breaths like these.